Christopher Columbus actually may have done more traveling after he was dead than when he was alive. In 1542, his body was dug up for a truly shocking reason. It wasn't returned until 1898. Welcome to History Snob. Today we're taking a look at the lesser-known facts of Christopher Columbus's life, the things we weren't taught in school. Christopher Columbus is one of the most famous names in history, and yet there are still a surprising number of mysteries surrounding him. For example, where was Columbus from? The answer might surprise you. Most scholars believe that he was born in Genoa, Italy. However, some have theorized he was actually from Spain, Greece, or even Poland. Even the name Christopher Columbus is up for debate. In Italian, he's known as Cristoforo Colombo, which for a long time was thought to be his real birth name. In Spanish, his name is Cristobal Colon. Also, he was referred to by himself and others as Cristobal, Cristovam, Cristoferus de Colombo, and even Poal de Colon. Theories even go as far as claiming that he adopted the name Columbus from a pirate named Colombo. On the topic of names, there are also some questions about the real names of his ships, as well as what those names actually meant. Now, bear in mind, sailors are known for having a dirty sense of humor. Pretty much everyone learned in school that Columbus's ships were called Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. However, it was common back then to name ships after saints and then give them nicknames. The Santa Clara was nicknamed Nina in honor of its owner, Juan Nino. The Santa Maria was also nicknamed La Galaga after the province of Galicia, where it was built. As for Pinta, Pinta is Spanish for the painted one, which is another way of saying hooker. I bet they thought they were being very cheeky with that. More shocking is the real reason Columbus embarked on his voyages. The reasons we were taught in school are a lot more innocent than the true explanation. A common myth is that Columbus set out to prove the Earth was round. This isn't true though. The Earth being round had been well established since ancient times. Actually, Columbus didn't believe the Earth was a globe. He proposed a far stranger idea. Based on his readings of the angles of the North Star, Columbus believed the Earth was pear-shaped. Now this may sound crazy, but it's actually a theory some famous scientists dabbled with, like Isaac Newton and Christian Huygens. As we alluded to, Columbus had some pretty sketchy reasons for sailing across the giant pear. Columbus was trying to get to Asia, which was much farther away than he thought because he had misjudged the shape of the Earth. One of the main reasons was to find the Japanese gold Marco Polo wrote about. This would have terrible consequences when Columbus instead landed in America. Columbus refused to believe that he hadn't landed in Asia, and he wanted his golden shower. So he became obsessed with stealing the modest amounts of gold native people had. He really didn't want to go home empty-handed. But what Columbus did next was far worse. On top of stealing gold, Columbus also took people. He kidnapped 500 natives and then took them back to Spain, even though slavery wasn't exactly a common practice at this point. In fact, the reaction to this was actually pretty shocking. Queen Isabella of Spain was disgusted with Columbus gifting her human beings, so much so that she reportedly rejected this so-called gift. Columbus is best known for his 1492 voyage. What he did afterwards was less well known, but honestly it was still pretty interesting. Columbus actually made 4 voyages to America while he was alive. He went on some crazy journeys after he was dead, but more on that later. Each time Columbus returned to the Americas, he pressed farther into the continent. Eventually, he visited the Caribbean, South America, and Central America. But, of course, Columbus wasn't the first European to visit the Americas. Actually, that title remains disputed to this day. About 500 years before Columbus's first voyage, the Viking Leif Erikson explored the east coast of Canada. He and his crew landed in Nova Scotia, which they called Vinland, and on Baffin Island, which they called Helluland. But in case you think this is just a theory, the Vikings left one startling piece of evidence behind. In what is today Newfoundland, the Vikings actually established a small settlement, which was capable of housing up to 160 people at the time. Today, this location is called L'Anse aux Meadows. The Vikings called it Markland. It is not clear why the Vikings left. but it's clear they didn't stay for long because they left no burial site. Still, it's crazy to think that the Vikings crossed the treacherous Atlantic in tiny longboats. But there's another candidate for the title of first European to visit the New World, and he's actually a saint. Some have theorized that the famous voyager Saint Brendan actually made it as far as Canada, a few centuries earlier than the Vikings. Although there's no hard evidence supporting this. But there is hard evidence Columbus was kind of stubbornly stupid, to say it nicely. Now, one might reasonably think that Christopher Columbus eventually realized he had discovered a new continent. Sooner or later, he had to have figured out that he wasn't actually in Asia, right? Nope. He died still insisting he'd found an express route to Japan. Ignorance really is bliss. This brings us to another surprising thing about Columbus. Despite his explorations, he was not popular in his own time. Actually, people kind of hated him, and there's a few reasons why. Columbus really struggled to get funding for his voyage in the first place. He had to do a fair bit of lobbying. He expressed his desire to travel across the Atlantic to find spices, gold, a safer route to the east, and introduce Christianity to the people he'd meet. But he was turned down. A lot. First by France, then England, and then Spain. The reason why is pretty hilarious. Basically, other experts repeatedly tried to warn him that his calculations were way off. They tried to explain that he was badly underestimating the circumference of the Earth and that his voyage wouldn't end in Asia, but in the middle of nowhere. But good old Columbus refused to listen. Finally, in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain decided to fund him. Probably to get rid of him, honestly. But there are more sinister examples of why people didn't like Columbus, and some of it is pretty unnerving. At one point, he actually had to be arrested. In 1500, during his adventures in the New World, a Spanish officer was sent to investigate multiple reports of misconduct by Columbus. What he found was utter mayhem. The officer documented a long list of Columbus's brutality. Columbus once punished a man for stealing corn by having his ears and nose cut off and then selling him into slavery. The officer noted this wasn't a one-time thing either. On multiple occasions, Columbus used torture and mutilation to cover his colony of Hispaniola, the island that today comprises of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He congratulated his brother Bartholomew for defending the family, meaning he ordered a woman to be paraded naked through the streets and then cut out her tongue because she spoke ill of Columbus. The report also described how he put down multiple natives. First, he ordered a brutal suppression, which led to many deaths. He then showed the mangled bodies in the streets to discourage others from rebellion. The investigation eventually led to Columbus's arrest and imprisonment. He was locked up in San Domingo on the island of Hispaniola for 6 weeks before King Ferdinand ordered his release. If Columbus was brutal to his enemies, the fate of his friends was sometimes just as bad. On Christmas Eve of 1492, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, ran into a coral reef on the north coast of Hispaniola. While Columbus returned to Spain, along with a new batch of slaves, 40 men from his crew were left behind with a crazy assignment. He ordered them to create the first European settlement in the Americas, known as La Navidad, in modern-day Haiti. However, when he returned, all of his men were dead. The story of what happened to them was truly crazy. Columbus learned from a native leader that his men fought over gold, and even stole women from the local tribe. Fed up, the natives eventually burned down their fort and killed them all. It is taught in school that by the time Columbus died, he had taken the lives of many indigenous people, but the actual number might surprise you. When Columbus came to Hispaniola, it is estimated that there were 300,000 natives living on the island. 50 years later, only 500 were left alive. It's not that Columbus exactly killed them all. In some ways, what he did was even worse. Columbus sold people into slavery, but he also forced them to work in awful circumstances to provide him with the goal he longed for. The native people rebelled against this repression, destroying their own food stores and starving themselves, or even throwing themselves off cliffs to escape exploitation. But the long-term consequences of Columbus's explorations are even more shocking. Between the waves of disease Europeans brought to the New World, the warfare, and other brutalities, around 56 million people, or around 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, would ultimately die. Even after all of this bloodshed, Columbus's heirs still fought the Spanish crown after his death for 300 years, all to receive what they believed they were owed for his conquests. During a violent storm on a return voyage, Columbus suffered what was believed to be gout. In subsequent years, he was plagued with influenza and other fevers. He reportedly bled from the eyes, had temporary blindness, and prolonged attacks of gout. As time went on, the attacks increased in duration and severity, sometimes leaving Columbus bedridden for months. After 14 years of this torment, he died due to all of his health complications. But modern analysis suggested that the real cause of Columbus's health problems was totally unknown at the time. Based on Columbus's lifestyle, it probably wasn't gout that he was suffering from, but reactive arthritis, a joint inflammation caused by intestinal bacterial infections, or after acquiring certain sexually transmitted infections. Columbus died in 1506, but as we mentioned before, his strangest voyage actually took place after his death. His body was uprooted for over 300 years, and the story is pretty odd. After his death in 1506, Columbus was buried in Valladolid, Spain, although his travels did not yet conclude. In fact, his body did about as much voyaging as when it was alive. 3 years after his burial, his remains were dug up and taken to his family mausoleum, which was in Sevilla. Then, in 1542, in accordance with the will of Columbus's son Diego, his remains were moved to Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, which is the modern-day Dominican Republic. Hispaniola was later ceded to France by Spain, so in 1795 Columbus's bones were moved to Havana, Cuba. They stayed there for a little over 100 years before taking a final journey. In 1898, after Cuba became independent following the Spanish-American War, his remains were shipped back across the Atlantic Ocean and returned to Seville. In 1877, a priest discovered a lead box at Santo Domingo inscribed, "Discoverer of America, First Admiral." Inscriptions found the next year read, "The last remains of the first admiral, Sire Christopher Columbus, discoverer." Inside the box there were bones of an arm and a leg, along with a single bullet. These remains were considered legitimate, but the authorities in Santo Domingo have never allowed DNA testing of them, so it's up for debate if they really belong to Columbus or not. Today they sit in the Columbus Lighthouse in the Dominican Republic. I guess there is rest for the wicked. It just may take a few hundred years. Well, that's it for this video. How many of these facts did you already know? Are there any other not-so-well-known facts about Columbus that we didn't cover? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.